It's a Friday night in 1985, and somewhere in a strip mall parking lot, a station wagon pulls in packed with kids who just finished their homework in record time for one reason and one reason only. Through the glass doors ahead, there's a glow. Not sunlight, not streetlight. Something electric, something pulsing, blue and red and green all at once, spilling out onto the pavement like a promise. And before that door even swings open, you can already hear it. A wall of sound. Coins clinking into metal trays. Digitized explosions. A chiptune melody looping over and over, cheerful and relentless. Someone shouting that they just got the high score. This was the arcade. And for about 2 decades, it was one of the most important places in America that nobody thought to take seriously at the time. We're going to spend the next little while wandering back through that world. Not just the games, though we'll get to those. We're talking about the arcade itself as a place. As a piece of American social architecture that rose up almost out of nowhere, completely reshaped how a generation of kids spent their afternoons and their allowance money, and then, just as quickly as it appeared, faded into strip mall memory. So find a comfortable seat, maybe dig up an old photo if you've got one tucked away somewhere, and let's step back through those glass doors together. To understand why the arcade mattered so much, you have to understand what sociologists like to call a third place. Your first place is home. Your second place is work or school. But a third place is somewhere else entirely, somewhere that belongs to nobody and everybody, where you go not because you have to, but because you want to be around other people doing the same thing you're doing. For an earlier generation, that might have been the corner diner, or the soda fountain at the drugstore. For teenagers in the 70s and 80s, that role got picked up almost overnight by a room full of blinking cabinets and a change machine. Think about it. Before the arcade, where exactly was a 14-year-old supposed to go? The diner belonged to the grown-ups, or at least to an older crowd of greasers and gearheads. The mall was fine for wandering, but it wasn't built around anything you could actually do. The arcade solved that problem completely. It gave kids a destination, an activity, and a social scene all rolled into one storefront. You didn't need a car, though plenty of kids convinced someone to drive them. You didn't need much money, just a pocketful of quarters. And once you were inside, you were part of something. That's the piece that gets lost when people just remember the arcade as the place with Pac-Man. It wasn't really about the games. It was about the room, and what a room it was. Let's just sit in that sensory memory for a moment, because if you grew up anywhere near one of these places, your body probably remembers it even before your brain does. The carpet, for one. Somebody, somewhere, decided that the ideal arcade flooring was a wild geometric pattern in blacklight reactive colors, all triangles and starbursts in purple and orange and teal, practically vibrating under the fluorescent tubes mounted along the ceiling. It looked like nothing else in American retail, before or since. It was there partly to hide the dirt and the spilled soda, sure, but it also did something else. It told your eyes, immediately, that you were somewhere different now. Somewhere outside the normal rules of beige carpet and quiet indoor voices. Then there was the light itself. Every cabinet was its own little lighthouse, throwing color from the screen and the marquee art above it, that big backlit panel with the game's logo blazing out in reds and yellows, designed to catch your eye from clear across the room. Walk into a packed arcade at its peak and you were standing in a forest of glowing rectangles, CRT monitors humming away, each one a portal into some entirely different universe. Space battles in one corner. A boxing ring in another. A maze full of fruit and ghosts a few steps away. And layered over all of that light was the sound. Not music exactly, not in the way we usually mean it, but these bright, synthetic little melodies, built out of square waves and sine waves because that's all the hardware of the time could manage. Chip tunes, we call them now, though nobody called them that then. They just called it the sound of the arcade. Underneath it all, that steady mechanical percussion of quarters dropping into coin slots, and tokens rattling out of a dispenser when you fed a $5 bill into the change machine by the door. If you close your eyes right now and just picture an arcade, that soundscape is probably playing in your memory before you even notice it. That's the power of sensory nostalgia. It bypasses the thinking part of your brain entirely and just takes you straight back. But here's the thing that made the arcade so much more than a novelty. Once you were a regular, you weren't just a customer. You were part of a whole social ecosystem, one with its own rules, its own hierarchy, and its own language, and almost none of it was written down anywhere. It just got passed along kid to kid, the way traditions always do. Take the high score table. Most cabinets kept a running list of initials, 3 letters at a time, ranked by score, glowing right there on the attract screen whenever nobody was playing. Getting your initials onto that list wasn't just a personal achievement. It was a public declaration. Everybody who walked past that cabinet for the next however many days or weeks would see your initials sitting at the top, and they'd know, without ever meeting you, that somebody in this building could really play. Local legends got built this way. A kid nobody had ever spoken to could become famous within the four walls of that arcade just because their initials sat at the top of Galaga for 6 straight months. And when somebody finally knocked you off that list, that was a real event. That was a rivalry that could simmer for weeks. Then there was the etiquette, unspoken but absolutely enforced by peer pressure. If you wanted to play a machine that was currently occupied, you didn't just stand there awkwardly. You set a quarter down on the little ledge at the bottom of the screen. That was the universal signal. It meant I've got next. Everybody understood it, everybody respected it, and heaven help you if you tried to jump the line anyway. There was a whole pecking order to who got to play first, who got to watch, who was good enough to be worth watching in the first place. Older kids, the ones who could clear a game on a single quarter, commanded a kind of respect that had nothing to do with grades or sports or anything that mattered anywhere else. Inside those four walls, skill on a joystick was its own currency, and it bought you real status. There was slang too, plenty of it, most of it practical shorthand born out of necessity. You'd hear kids talking about one credit clears, about pattern memorization, about which machine on the floor had a stick that was a little loose and a little more forgiving because of it. Regulars knew which employee would look the other way if you were a quarter short. They knew which cabinet in the back corner nobody ever seemed to notice was slightly rigged in your favor. This was tribal knowledge, local to each individual arcade, and it made every location feel less like a chain store and more like a clubhouse that just happened to have a corporate name on the sign outside. Now, no story about American culture is complete without the classic rise and fall arc, and the arcade fits that shape almost perfectly, which is probably part of why it still resonates with us today. The rise came fast. Pinball had been around for decades already, tucked into the back of bowling alleys and pool halls, but it was really the arrival of video games in the mid to late 70s that changed everything. Suddenly you had games like Space Invaders pulling in so many quarters that in Japan, there were actual reported coin shortages because of it. Then came the games that would define the entire era. Asteroids. Pac-Man, which became such an enormous cultural phenomenon that it spilled over into cereal boxes and Saturday morning cartoons and a genuine chart-topping novelty song. Donkey Kong. Galaga. Centipede. Dig Dug. Each one pulling teenagers and plenty of adults too into these dedicated spaces built entirely around the coin-operated cabinet. By the early 80s, the arcade business had exploded into a genuine industry, generating billions of dollars a year, more at the box office in some years than movies and music combined, if you can believe that. Entrepreneurs and mall developers alike saw the writing on the wall. If you wanted foot traffic, if you wanted teenagers spending their allowance and their babysitting money somewhere in your shopping center, an arcade was practically a requirement. That's when the big chains really started to take hold, and it's worth slowing down here to talk about a few of them by name, because they each had their own personality, their own approach to pulling kids in the door. Aladdin's Castle was probably the most recognizable name across the country, a chain that leaned hard into that genie lamp, magic carpet theme, all purple and gold signage that practically glowed against the beige tile of a typical American shopping mall. They were everywhere, tucked into the anchor corridors of malls from coast to coast, and for a lot of kids growing up in the 80s, Aladdin's Castle wasn't just an arcade, it was basically synonymous with the mall itself. You'd go there after a movie at the multiplex, or while your parents were off shopping at the department store, and you'd disappear into that dark, neon-lit room for an hour with a pocket full of quarters and come out squinting into the fluorescent mall lighting like you'd just left a matinee. Time Out took a slightly different approach, often setting up shop as a standalone destination rather than always being buried deep inside a mall, sometimes with a slightly more grown-up, almost nightclub kind of energy to the branding, dark walls, bold geometric signage, leaning into that image of the arcade as a genuinely cool place to be seen, not just somewhere you got dragged along to. And then there was ShowBiz Pizza Place, which took the whole concept and fused it with something else entirely, the birthday party industry. ShowBiz combined the arcade cabinets with a full pizza restaurant and, most famously, an animatronic stage show featuring a house band of robotic characters, a bear on guitar, that kind of thing, performing looping musical numbers while families ate pizza in the booths nearby. It was genius, honestly. Parents got a controlled, supervised environment to host a birthday party. Kids got pizza, a show, and a room full of games, all in one stop. ShowBiz would later famously merge with a certain competing pizza and animatronics chain, but in its own era, it represented the arcade evolving into something even bigger, a full destination built around family entertainment rather than just teenagers killing time. These chains, and plenty of independent, mom-and-pop arcades besides, understood something important about their teenage customer base. They weren't just selling 5 minutes of gameplay for a quarter. They were selling a hangout. The lighting, the sound, the layout of the cabinets in rows that encouraged clustering and watching and cheering each other on, all of it was engineered, whether consciously or through years of trial and error, to keep kids in that building for hours, spending a little bit at a time, again and again. But nothing stays on top forever, and the very thing that made home video games possible in the first place eventually became the arcade's biggest threat. Through the 80s, home consoles kept getting better. The Nintendo Entertainment System landed in American living rooms in 1985 and gave kids something they'd never really had before: arcade-quality gameplay, or close enough to it, available anytime, for free, after the upfront cost of the console and the cartridge. No quarters required. No begging a parent for a ride to the mall. Just turn on the television and play. At first, the arcade industry adapted. They leaned into games that simply couldn't be replicated at home: elaborate cabinets with steering wheels and motion seats, games with graphics so far beyond what a home console could handle that going to the arcade still felt like the only way to see the cutting edge of what games could do. Fighting games in the early 90s, things like Street Fighter II, actually gave arcades a real second wind, because the head-to-head, same-room competitive element was something a home console with one television just couldn't easily offer yet. But it was a delaying action, not a reversal. The Sega Genesis, and then the Sony PlayStation in the mid-90s, kept closing that technology gap year after year, while home internet and, eventually, home consoles with online play started to offer something the arcade never really could: the ability to hang out with your friends without leaving your house at all. Combine that with rising real estate costs, changing mall demographics, and a generation of kids who simply had other options for how to spend their afternoons, and the slow decline through the 90s turned into something much closer to a collapse by the early 2000s. The big chains shuttered locations one by one. Malls that once anchored a bustling arcade in the food court corridor quietly let the space go dark, and the last cabinet, whichever one it happened to be in any particular town, usually got hauled off with far less fanfare than it deserved. No big goodbye, no send-off, just a closed sign taped to a door that used to glow with color you could see from the parking lot. And yet, here's the thing about the arcade. It never really disappeared from our collective memory, not the way plenty of other passing fads eventually did. Maybe that's because it represented something a little bit deeper than just entertainment. It was one of the last truly independent social spaces that belonged to kids and teenagers on their own terms, a place with its own economy, its own status system, its own community, built by nobody in particular and understood by everybody who walked through the door. You didn't need permission to belong there. You just needed a quarter and the willingness to lose a few games before you finally beat your own high score. So the next time you catch that flicker of neon somewhere, or hear a scrap of an old chiptune melody drifting out of a phone speaker, take a second and let yourself go back there. Back to the blacklight carpet and the coin trays and the crowd gathered 3 deep around whoever was on a hot streak. Back to a version of American youth culture that existed for barely 2 decades, burned incredibly bright, and left behind a whole generation of grown adults who still, to this day, remember exactly which corner of which arcade held their favorite machine. That's the story of the forgotten arcade hangout, and honestly, it deserves to be remembered a little louder than it usually is.